Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel. I am Aldo, Research Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Center at ISPI. Today we will talk about the role that the European Union and member states can play in the context of the Israel-Hamas war. So far, the conflict has revealed deep divisions among European countries and showed the extent to which it is hard and complex to find a common position. As you know, this event is organized under the framework of the Rome Dialogues, the annual initiative on the wider Mediterranean region co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. As I just mentioned, today we will discuss the role that Europe has played or has not played in this first month after the outbreak of the worst expression of violence in Israel-Palestine in decades. After the unity showed with the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a lot of signs of disunion when we look at the European position on the war in Gaza. For example, we have seen institutional disorder in Brussels, with competition on the line to follow between top EU officials. And we have also seen harsh disagreements on the terms to use when asking to humanitarian corridors and pauses. We have seen different positions and perceptions of the member states on the war. We have some European countries favoring a strong pro-Israel line and others wanting to emphasize the protection of Palestinian civilians. It is particularly interesting the vote of the United Nations last week. We showed very different positions with some European countries voting in favor, others abstaining, and others rejecting the resolution on the humanitarian truce. And finally, we have seen the emergence of political and social divisions within member states. In fact, European public opinions are divided by the proposed and then implemented bans on pro-Palestine protests, by political polarization and instrumentalizations, by the fear of a resurgence in terrorism after the trauma of the wave of attacks Europe experienced between 2015 and 2018, and by the harsh reality of rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in many European countries. So it is therefore extremely untimely to questioning the genesis of these divisions and their impact in terms of geopolitical vulnerability, and to try to understand how the contradictions emerged over the past weeks will impact the future relations between the EU, Israel, and Palestine, and more broadly between Europe, the wider MENA region, and the so-called Global South. These are very crucial questions for the future of the Union, because with the war in Ukraine, with the war in the Middle East, with tensions in the Caucasus region and in the Balkans, it is the entire European neighborhood that is at risk of destabilization. Today, we have the pleasure to discuss all these dynamics and to try to provide answers to all these questions with three very distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them. ZAID EYADAT, who is Director of the Jordanian Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. DALIA GHANEM, Senior Analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And finally, with Antonio MISSIROLI, who is Senior Advisor here at ISPI and former assistant of the NATO Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Thank you all for your very kind availability. So, as always, I remember you the rules of this conversation. We have around 45 minutes. I will start with the 2-3 questions according to the time we have, and then we will have a quick Q&A session open to the audience. So, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. And I also remind you that we have a Twitter page where you can follow our activities and any updates on our virtual events and relevant publications. So let's start this conversation on the role of the EU in the context of the war in Gaza. I will start with Antonio MISSIROLI. Antonio, what are the main reasons behind the lack of unity in the European position over the conflict, and how in your opinion, the ongoing war in Israel-Palestine is exposing the limits of the EU common foreign policy?
Well, the reasons are numerous, of course, for what I would call differences among the member states, among the governments, difference across parties, differences also inside public opinion across Europe. Some of these reasons are of historical nature. They are related to the perception of the conflict over the decades. They are related to the legacy of anti-Semitism or even the Holocaust in the case of some countries. They are related to the reality of Muslim immigration into the European Union itself. And they are related, of course, to all the cleavages that existed already, especially after the 6 Days War in 1966-67 across Europe over how to side in the conflict. I don't have the time now to elaborate on the details of this, but I would also like to emphasize the fact that there have been shifts in the allegiances and positions of governments and citizens across Europe in this particular respect. And I would say that even in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attack, reactions have evolved to some extent. We have seen what people have called a degree of cacophony coming from Brussels, in part due also to petty interinstitutional rivalries. I mean, it's a fact of life sometimes. We have seen, however, also a gradual readjustment. Some of those differences seems to have been set aside. And of course, everybody is looking at what is happening on the ground. I think we have all to be aware that this is an issue that is not limited to the specific episode of the Hamas terrorist attack and the reaction by the Israeli government. I think there is an historical context. It's not happening in a vacuum. These are very, very sensitive issues across the world and inside public opinion. Europe managed to be very, very united on the issue for a limited season, a limited period of time, which was basically between the Oslo Accords and the last steps, the last attempts that were made to implement those Oslo Accords, roughly between the early 1990s and the early years of the current century, the current millennium. In that context, the European Union played a very positive role, coordinated with the Clinton administration in particular. I do remember that Miguel Angel Moratinos, who was the special envoy for the Middle East in the European Union, also was taken very seriously as a mediator in the last-ditch negotiations in 1999-2000. And after that, of course, after the deal disappeared from the screen and other events took over, the situation has evolved. To some extent, we are still stuck in that mentality, in that period, and we still think that we can recreate the kind of situation. But in 20 years, many, many things have changed inside the Middle East, and many things have changed inside the European Union. Everybody draws the comparison with the EU reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes, I do agree that there is a difference, that the European Union managed to get united sooner, probably, although if you remember at the very beginning, it was not so easy to find a common understanding about what was going on and what needed to be done to deal with that. I would say that the current situation is not static. The differences that people have noticed are not fundamental in my personal view, nor they are unsurmountable. We have also to be aware that the influence of the European Union on the current crisis is limited. Just compare us with the US president. The US president is currently unable to restrain the Israeli government, just to give you an idea. And therefore, we are to some extent spectators with limited leverage on what is happening. On top of that, our societies are divided. There are demonstrations for one side or the other. We live in a digital age in which these differences are emphasized with a multiplier effect. We have no control over what is circulating on social media and in cyberspace, and that makes the situation much less easy to govern. I confess that I myself sometimes am puzzled by what I see on TV, what I hear in TV debates. The quality of the public debate is very bad, and I do have some understanding for those leaders who are trying to keep together a reasonable position in all this.
Thank you, Antonio. Going a little bit deeper into the relations between European countries and the MENA region in the context of the ongoing war, Dalia, is the European Union, are European member states bound to lose the Middle East? To lose their influence with Middle Eastern countries, and what is the future of the European Union as a player in the region?
So, as you said and Antonio said before me, clearly we have here a clash. So, despite maintaining an alignment on Ukraine, and Europe was able to show unity for almost nearly 2 years now, the EU's reaction to the war in Gaza has significantly impacted the bloc's capacity to reach a unified stance and a crucial and pivotal foreign policy issue. The war in Gaza showed the divide between political families, between state members, and of course, the war in Gaza is fueling the worst kind of identity politics in Europe. And this is going to have a serious impact on the future of the continent. So the EU's legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of, leaders of the global South, between quotes, but also in the eyes of its own citizens is at stake here. I think, bottom line, the between quotes, the geopolitical EU that we would like to see, matching China, America, or even Turkey is very far. So let me take a step back on what the EU did when the war started. So, the first decision besides, the decision to put the Israeli flag on EU institution, a decision that actually was met by many EU member of the parliament with anger, the EU decided to announce that it would stop all development assistance to Palestine. And this action, holds a significant gravity since that the EU is the largest donor to the Palestinian. Just to give you a number, the support, which has proven to be very steady and stable since 2008, has averaged around 1.2 billion euros a year across all member states. Within this combined total, the EU share managed by Brussels amount to 300 million. Fortunately, HRVP Joseph Borrell, explained that this decision is going to be reversed back, and so the assistance continued. And then on October 13, the Commission's leader, Ursula von der Leyen, decided to embark on a journey to Israel. Later that week, she delivered a message that was very sympathetic to Israel. While back home in EU capitals, her colleagues were angry because she neglected to emphasize their concern that any Israeli response must adhere to the principles of international law. And this also shows the divide. Successive government announced that, quote unquote, she was not speaking exclusively she was speaking exclusively for herself and not on behalf of the EU. Again, this shows the cacophony and the divide. Of course, we've seen also a minute of silence 3 weeks ago in Brussels for the Israeli victims. We haven't seen any minute of silence for the 10,000 Palestinians that died, civilians, innocent, children and women. And this is, again, very symbolic, but it holds, its weight. So to come back to your question, Aldo, and I will develop it later, in the eyes of the global public opinion, but in the eyes also of the global South and the Arab street between codes, the double standard here is very clear. And, EU regional allies such as Jordan King Abdullah actually denounced the belated and the inefficient response of the EU. And I think, his speech to a certain extent is very representative of what people think in the global south, but also what the leadership is thinking. He said, and I quote him in his speech, he said, the message is loud and clear to the Arab world. The lives of Palestinians are of less value than those of Israeli. Unfortunately, this is what is felt in the global south. This is what the Arab street has been feeling, So the EU leader, whether, they lost the global south for good, I can't answer this question. But my opinion is that they suffer from a serious reputational damage that is caused by the war in Gaza, and their moral, people have been insisting on geopolitics, but also on the moral stance of the EU, saying that you cannot come tell us about human rights and then you do not respect human rights or just dismiss them when it is about Palestinian. So I think the EU does not have a problem of reputation now, credibility in the region. And again, the vote of the EU when we've seen that 4 countries voted against the ceasefire, 8 voted for, 15 abstained. Again, that is sending very, very poor message to the global south. The message is, as King Abdullah said, loud and clear, the lives of Palestinians are not worth the life of Ukrainians. And again, there are things that we can say more and there are things that we can do more, and we will come to this. But I think the bottom line is that the EU needs to work with every partner in the global south separately to fix, if I may say, this damaged image.
Thank you very much, Dalia. So let's move to ZAID, because actually I would like to know what is the point of view of MENA countries on the reaction and on the divisions of the European Union. How are the countries of North Africa and the Middle East perceiving these many different positions? Maybe you are muted, ZAID.
Well, thank you, Aldo. I'm going to follow suit with my colleagues Antonio and Dalia, and I agree with what they've been already saying and proposed. Let me start by saying the image of EU in the MENA region is a weakened player at best. Double standards policies, moral failure, and hypocrisy. And this is a widespread views in all Arab countries in the MENA region. And the EU policies towards MENA, and in particular towards the Palestinian issue, been seen in the eyes of the public and leaders of the region as being, one more time, conformity with hypocrisy. To the extent that so many observers, experts actually been proposing that what the EU is doing is just helping keeping the suffering of the Palestinians by lacking ability to play a role bringing Israel to the table with the Palestinians, so act as a mediator and provide a conducive environment that enable the two parties to arrive to an agreement, a peace kind of agreement. And yes, Antonio, Americans till now they barely can impact or influence the Israelis' leadership's decisions of the war, but probably we will agree that well, the Americans sees eye to eye with that Israeli sees in this particular time. So it's not only lack of influencing, but the absence of the desire to influence any change, because they think this should continue. So they read eye to eye, they see eye to eye. It is to them what it is to them. This is beyond the discussion here. So just to continue, the continuity of EU ineffective policies and belated reactions, as Dalia said, quoting kings of Jordan it is the image of EU, and I pity EU for itself. You know, it's not only divided; it is out of the game. I'm not sure if EU has any say in the global affairs. I'm not sure at all. And you know, there are some countries in EU trying to repositioning themselves. But I'm going to remind everyone here that you know, Germany's leaders went to Tel Aviv. And I've heard a speech that I never imagined to hear from Germany, saying that it is part of our political doctrine, ideology, to protect Israel and Israelis. Well, fine, you're free to think that way, but what about Palestinians on the other side? And how that is actually will enable you to be effective in mediating between the two parties. So what I'm trying to say, if you want to look at first how the problems, challenges the EU is facing, and the role EU is playing in global affairs, the images, the perceptions of the region, that you don't actually have to talk to the EU. They don't exist as a power. So you either talk to Israel in this case, or to the Americans, or you reach out all the way far to China. And this is puzzling, because Europeans deserve more than this and better than this for sure. And in certain points of the time when there have been charismatic leaders, Europe used to be the center of the world. And I'm not also referring to old centuries, a few years ago. In terms of its morality, it's all of its consistent policy on perspective of human rights, international law, international humanitarian law, saying the same language, and not make the feelings that kings of Jordan and all other leaders and public saying, well, obviously, yes, our life worthless, especially for Europeans. And in Jordan, you know, still we have so great hope in that Europe might do something. The first visits Jordan did, kings of Jordan, was to Europe, and 2 days ago he was in Brussels, hoping to, you know, push the Europeans to get their act together, to get into, you know, to live up to their moral standards, and to what the people in the region always looked up to see in Europe's behaviors. As you know, we run surveys and polls. And, you know, before this started, we're talking about the Arab barometers, new wave that will be actually talking and measuring people's perceptions of European engagement and role in this conflict. But what we done in Jordan, and as a CSS, Center for Strategic Studies, the majority of Jordanians and Arab citizens in the MENA region think that Europeans' role in this war was insufficient, inefficient, and biased. As we speak, European commissions just talking to some development agencies, I think to DEFIX, trying to find some fund, actually allocating fund to strengthen Europe-Israel relation on one-to-one basis as we speak. Check it out.
Thank you, ZAID. So just to conclude, this topic is extremely interesting of the double standards, because you all highlighted this point. So Antonio, in your opinion, what long-term fractures and cleavages can this attitude create between the EU and its neighborhood, and if overall this attitude will affect EU leadership in the long term?
Well, of course, this is a very fluid moment, and I think the what is happening in Gaza is likely to have an impact that goes well beyond Gaza, well beyond Palestine, well beyond the Middle East, in terms of realignments and so on and so forth. It is very difficult to assess or try and even and guess what that impact could be like, because it depends very much on the next developments on the ground and the reactions of the different players. Let me, however, point out to the fact that although there is a widespread insistence, and correctly so, on the respect of human rights and international humanitarian law and pressure on Israel, coming from Washington as much as from Europe and other players worldwide. Even when it comes to the specific source of the crisis, countries like Qatar and Turkey have been much more supportive of Hamas than all the other Arab states, and in particular the Gulf monarchies, the other Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So divisions exist also in the Muslim and the Arab world in this particular respect, not only inside Europe. And it is precisely here that lies probably the key to the future of the region and the conflict. We are still stuck in this mentality whereby the two-state solution, the Americans will pay for the resettlement of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, the Europeans will fund the Palestinian Authority. I'm not entirely sure that 20 years after Taba, that is still a feasible and a viable solution. Maybe we have to think in different terms. But what is essential here is a strong intervention by the international community, not only the European Union. I mean, external influences and interference in the region from outside have been more negative than positive over the past decades. Let's be honest about this. Be it from the United States, be it from former European colonial power, or be it from other Arab countries as well, who played a divisive role and supported different factions, even inside the Palestinian camp. I think an international intervention that the European Union will be delighted to support and contribute to is the solution, but also it is important that the Arab world as a whole supports a peaceful solution. I mean, in particular, the Gulf monarchies today have all the resources that are necessary in order to deal with this crisis, which was not necessarily the case 20 or 40 years ago, but today they could make a difference. And of course, before the 7th of October, we were already seeing movement in that respect. You may remember the Abraham Accords between some Arab countries and Israel itself, the negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I think there is perhaps there a glimmer of hope that things could change. The European Union risks losing credit in some of the neighboring countries, perhaps. I don't think that that is the main concern at this particular moment in time. There is a concern about also the domestic reverberations and ramifications of the crisis. I think there are risks of demonstration, there are risks of violent actions, including potentially a return of terrorism. We have already seen a couple of episodes over the past couple of weeks. Even in a city like London, on Saturday, there will be, on the one hand, the remembrance ceremony, which is a very heartfelt ceremony in the UK, and a pro-Palestinian demonstration nearby. And there's a lot of concern that the situation could degenerate, not because of the peaceful demonstrators in support of the civilians in Gaza, but because of those little groups that could be tempted to make havoc and create havoc all across the city. And similar concern drove the French president to ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So there are also a number of issues that are related to the inside of the European Union. Not to forget the risk of a general conflagration in the region, the risk of another spike in energy prices, and a degeneration of the security situation, with consequence also on what is happening in Ukraine or elsewhere around Europe. So I think that there is genuine concern about what is happening. Maybe the concern about the EU's reputation in the MENA region is not on top of the agenda right now.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for the interesting points. Just to come back to the question of the two-state solution, actually, we have seen a sort of downplaying of the question of Palestine in recent years, and also European foreign policy towards the MENA region has been focused on other issues such as the migration crisis, the Iranian nuclear deal, the Islamic State, etc., etc. So 2 weeks ago, the Council of the European Union has accepted the Spanish proposal to hold a peace conference in about 6 months, which is supposed to relaunch the two-state solution. ZAID, what do you think about this attempt? And in your opinion, this war will change the European attitude towards a durable solution of the Israel-Palestine conflict? mute.
Okay, I'm not sure again I change it. And these are very difficult times. You can't really make long-term predictions on the current reactions, perceptions, and behavior. And I can see, in the larger context, it's in the country. Maybe it is Europe who might be more of the place or the countries to push for or help in restalling and the peace process or peace talks. As we know, at least, two countries in Europe proposed that. Well, Spain submitted the request to host the peace conference, second Madrid conference, if you wish, and Norway as well. And you and I probably and the rest know that there are so many back channels, track twos taking place, led by lots or many of the European countries, trying to bring in, both sides in the conflict, Arabs and Israel, Palestinians and Israelis, to come to a conclusion. Now, this is a long term. This is aftermath. This is after the war, which is all important. And as a politicians, decision makers, thinking of the strategic logic of the logic of strategic actions and interaction is important. But for now, I have just to give some clarification and get to what needs to be done in order for that to happen. And Antonio, just yes, Qatar and Turkey probably having different positions, but Turkey is not an Arab country. All Arab Qatar relation to Hamas is an agreeable. I'm not different than Qatar. I'm just clarifying. Is agreed upon by the Israelis. Actually, when Qatar, when the money coming from Qatar to Hamas used to be late, it was Netanyahu and Israelis who go to Qatar and push for the money to come. So that is that relation. We know what it means, and we know the limitations and the red lines, the rules of engagement in that relation, if you wish. Now, and yes, there are so many differences in their board. MENA region is not paradise, it's not a heaven. We all know that, and that suffers all of its problem, and the problems did not go away. Probably going to be only deepened. But they agree in two important things. They all condemn the killing of the civilians on both sides, all of them, with no exception. And this is remain to be seen in Europe. And second, they all call for a ceasefire now, immediately, for humanitarian needs and reasons. And they never call for something just been created in the West, called pauses for humanitarian needs. I'm not sure if this is legal. And I can imagine it talking to people in the region. So, okay, let's pause 10 minutes, 2 hours. So we give some food and some water to these poor people here. All right, 2 hours is over, go kill. What is that? So this is something also we need to think about. So what I'm trying to say, the problem today, the differences between, or the anger in the streets, in Europe, in MENA, and everywhere, that we all condemn the killing of the civilians, but we never seen a systematic killing of civilians as we see. And we never seen the lack and ineffective international interference to stop it. In fact, the Americans are saying it's not time to stop it. Can you imagine that? And no one else saying, let's do ceasefire. Just give me one single country in Europe say ceasefire. Ceasefire. Truce. No one. So given all of that, our immediate problem is to stop this killing machine, because people die every day. Thereafter, what we're going to do and how we're going to do, I am certain, and I don't know how long, but in a few months, all parties will be sitting on the table negotiating terms of peace. And so many experts saying already there are so many plans. It is about the details of these plans, what to do and not to do, and how much of Gaza, which part of Gaza, PA, PLO, international forces, who will be ruling whom, etc. So there are so many proposals of aftermath. But my concern is actually over the moment.
Thank you, ZAID. So You have a question to Dalia on the impact of the ongoing war on EU relations with North Africa. We have seen the relations with this part of the Mediterranean being a little bit strained by a lot of issues, from the management of migration flows to the Western Sahara issue to, for example, most recently by the attempted financial support to Tunisia. So what do you think relations between the northern and the southern shores of the Mediterranean will be affected by the current war?
Yes, as ZAID said, the priority now should be the ceasefire. We need to stop those massacres. And Antonio said, you know, I don't think that the reputational damage is on top of priority. Probably, yes, he's right, but this should be actually in top of priority, because again, the partners in the South are very important. We've seen several times, including during the Arab Spring, that what happens in the MENA does not stay in the MENA. It has serious spillover and repercussions in terms of security, migration, energy, and so on and so forth. So the EU needs to work on its image. The EU right now does not project power outside. It projects divide and weakness. It did not, as ZAID said, live up to its moral standards. And this is very serious. Rebuilding trust with its southern partner should be a priority. There is, as you said, Aldo, the International Peace Conference to revive the talks on the two-state solution. This is also a good first step. But you know, it was a demand of Spain, actually, you know, that has a stronger support for the Palestinians. But as the war escalates, I am afraid that the divide and the division within the EU are likely also to escalate, which could further delegitimize the bloc as a foreign policy actor. Now, one word on something, on the possibility, on the capability of the EU doing that. Regardless of the division, it is improbable that the EU would have exerted significant, you know, influence over Israel reaction. You know, I don't think it has the capability to do so, because look, the EU could not do anything about, you know, the territorial dispute that is happening on its backyard between Azerbaijan and Armenia. You know, last month, for instance, Azerbaijan expelled tens of thousands of Armenians from a contested enclave. What did the EU do about it? Not much, you know. Kosovo and Serbia continue to clash despite Brussels treaties. And as you may know, a contract between the European Union and Tunisia to reduce migration across the Mediterranean has dramatically and poorly failed. Qais Said gave back 60 million that the EU had paid to secure the deal. So it shows again, and it seems, and this will be my last word, it seems that the EU experienced the consequences of geopolitical development rather than actively shaping them. Now, one positive note on that, we need to remember that it is the EU also, you know, beside being the biggest donor to Palestinian, it is the EU that, you know, came up, you know, with this idea of the two-state solution. It is the EU that pushed, you know, the self-determination for the Palestinian idea, you know, and then the US took it back, of course. But the EU used to weigh. There was a time when the EU used to weigh on the international arena. So today, the EU needs to take a courageous action for Gaza, for the Palestinians, to stop the war, and the priority is for a ceasefire. In the meantime, unfortunately, you know, the reputational damage is there. It will take years to fix that. And of course, in the meantime, you know, thousands of people are being killed by I want to say, as it was called, the most moral army in the Middle East.
Thank you, Dalia. So we have only 5 minutes, so I will try to mix up the questions I prepared with those we have received from the audience. But I so try to to limit your answers to 2 minutes at max. So Dalia, I will start with you. It is interesting and said the proliferation of anti-Semitic acts in France, anti-Jewish violence in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, for example, we have seen also a rise of Islamophobic offenses by 140% compared to last year. I mean, there is a sort of wave of racism in Europe after the outbreak of the war. In your opinion, there is also a lot of political polarization and instrumentalization of what is happening in the Middle East. So in your opinion, how is this polarization influencing the foreign policy of European countries?
Of course, Aldo, as I said in the beginning, the war in Gaza is fueling the worst kind of identity politics in Europe. And Antonio said it before. I think the public debate is poor. I think also, I will say it very simply, because people and journalists, especially, they have a great responsibility in pushing towards this identity politics. If you could see the debate, for instance, right now in France, I am living in France, you would cry. You feel that, they are raising, tensions. They are pushing people for, more Islamophobia, more racism, more anti-Semitism, and so on, so forth. But again, this is not a question of religion. Would Israel have been an Islamic, republic? The problem would have been the same. It is a question of colonization. So again, the Palestinians are fighting for the right for the lands. And I think this doesn't exist in the public debate, which makes it very a very religious, question. It is not. I personally live in one of the most diverse area in Paris, which is the 19th. Jewish and Muslim people have been living here for years. We haven't seen any kind of incident. We haven't seen any kind of anti-Semitism. But again, the media has a great responsibility in pushing the narrative that this is a war, this is a clash of civilization, this is a clash of two religions. No, it is not, again. And again, it is very important to remind here that what we are seeing now did not start on October 7. It has been going on for the 50 last years. And as long as we do not have a solution for Palestine, we will continue to have this kind of spillover, identity politics, racism, and so on and so forth in the European continent. And this is very dangerous for Europe. And again, as I said, many European citizens are losing faith in their institution because, again, when you call yourself, calling for human rights and so on and so forth, you need to stand for this more. You have a moral, a responsibility to fix the problem. And again, the question is, how long is this end, and when this is going to stop? Is there a rate? Is there a toll that they fixed, to say, okay, we got our revenge. We killed 25,000 Palestinians. Now we are done. So again, I think nobody really can fathom the seriousness, the dangerosity of what's going on right now in Gaza and how this is going to have serious impacts for the months and the year to come on the European continent.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Antonio, we have seen how the rise of the Islamic State some years ago has galvanized thousands of young radicalized people in Europe. Could the ongoing military campaign against Hamas and the ground offensive in Gaza have the same galvanizing effect on radicalized youth in Europe today? So do we have to fear a rise of terrorist threat on European soil? You are muted. Antonio, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, we had a couple of episodes already over the past couple of weeks in France and in Belgium, and it is very difficult to predict whether there will be a multiplier effect, a sort of imitation effect over the next days and weeks, in particular in light of what is happening on the ground in Gaza. That could be an inspiration, so to speak, for other acts. It is a very confusing situation, I have to say. Probably the most striking political development across Europe over the past couple of years has been the rise of right-wing populist parties virtually everywhere across the European Union. Now, these parties have a tradition of anti-Semitism, a very, very strong tradition of anti-Semitism. Today, from France to Italy to other countries, they are pro-Israel. Because to some extent, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiments are trumping anti-Semitism. And this is also contributing to the kind of confusion of messages. And as I said, the digital age has a very negative effect on this because it further polarizes. And even fair information about what is happening on the ground is basically overtaken by what is circulating on the web. And I think this is, yet again, a source of concern that could make the predominance of a rational solution to this crisis more difficult in all possible respects.
Thank you, Antonio. So, final question that has been asked by a lot of people among our audience. How can a state, Israel in this case, negotiate with a non-state actor and a terrorist group, Hamas? ZAID.
Well, they don't have to, and they've been negotiating with Hamas anyway for too long. I think Hamas and Israel has both put together a working kind of relation for the last 15, 18 years, if you wish, since the withdrawal from Gaza and the takeover of Hamas from the PA, taking Gaza from the PA back in 2005 and 6. You know, it's also not very it's not very unusual for states to negotiate with non-state actors, whether terrorists or others. Americans negotiated with everyone else at points where they say they never talk to terrorist groups. Given the fact that Hamas is a terrorist group, well, it is so in Europe, it's so in America, and so in Israel. That's not necessarily so in the other parts of the world. But here's what I tell you. Aside from all those, as important as they are, those emotional and moral and humanitarian concerns that we've been talking about, I think we're getting into maybe a stage where Israel and the Palestinians will have an agreement on a two-state solution that might be to some extent satisfying to both parties' aspiration, less to the Palestinians so, but given, you know, the power balance and the regional context, I think Israel will be sitting with Palestinians soon and negotiating the future of peace process in the region.
Thank you, thank you. Unfortunately, we have finished the time we had, so a big thank to all our guests, to Antonio, to Dalia, to ZAID. Thank you for your this interesting discussion and for having shared with us your perspectives and insights. Thanks to our audience, and see you soon. Next week we will organize an event on the impact of the war on Lebanon. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you.